Jay, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to KubeFM. Just really quick, can you tell us who you are, what's your role, and where do you work?
Of course. So my name is Jason Smith, but I go by Jay. I'll respond to either, so nobody should over obsess over which one to call me. I am a customer engineer, a cloud architect, kind of used interchangeably at Google Cloud.
What are three Kubernetes emerging tools that you're keeping an eye on?
So it's hard to find what is exactly emerging, so to speak. But some that I've found interesting is Kuberay has been pretty interesting as of late. I just recently got into Core. I keep forgetting what it's. I think it's Kubernetes Object Resources. So kind of similar to Crossplane to those who are familiar with Crossplane. That one is looking actually kind of promising, especially since it has backing from the big three clouds. We'll see what winds up happening with the future. And always one that I'm starting to look at more is Dapr. In the vein of uh, platform engineering, it seems very promising as it kind of provides an API layer for deploying resources, not just Kubernetes resources, cloud resources, and all that stuff. So these are things I'm looking into, and I think are very promising. And I'm sure some of your listeners are like, "Oh, we've heard about this 100 times already," but to me, these are emerging, really interesting ones.
Now, on the subject of infrastructure as code, one of our podcast guests, Brian, suggested the current infrastructure as code paradigm has reached diminishing returns. What new approaches do you think could revolutionize infrastructure management in Kubernetes?
So I am a big fan of Pulumi for as an infrastructure as code. They're all good, but this is why. I think one of the ideas of infrastructure as code that has been missing is the code part. So I think one thing that I think makes infrastructure as code easier, especially when we're talking about developers who are the end users, especially as we're entering this advent of AI, ML, which is data science driven, data scientists, groups that use Python, R, different programming languages, and we're starting to talk about infrastructure, platform engineering, excuse me. Uh, a big one that we are starting to see is, hey, how do we actually make it easier for people to use Kubernetes? And there's a lot of different ways to do it, but one way I've always thought would be, what if you could just write Kubernetes objects as Python objects, or as you would write something in Go, learn a new library the same way you would learn PyTorch or something like that. So I think one thing that could revolutionize if more companies started to adopt, and we're starting to see a lot of these code packages that kind of will allow you to write code and transform it to YAML or Terraform, HCL, whatever the case might be. Any one of those variety of infrastructure as code tools out there. But I think if we start taking a code first approach to infrastructure as code, we'll start to see major changes and make it easier for people to use Kubernetes because there's still something like, according to a recent survey, like something like half of the people, 50% of the people who've implemented Kubernetes are saying, I thought Kubernetes was going to be easier than this. So, meet them where they are with what they already know.
Common thing that we hear about when asking people what their least favorite feature of Kubernetes is, a lot of them answer that overall complexity and the steep learning curve were definitely two of the biggest turnoffs. On the subject of platform engineering and tooling, one of our guests, Angel, stressed that standardizing everything makes cluster management easier. What's your advice for building platforms that can be used by several teams in an organization?
Understand your team first. That is something I always tell my customers. This is something that I've believed my entire career. Well, I shouldn't say my entire career, something that I learned. But it is something that I believe is very important is a lot of people are chasing tools. So a new tool comes out, they're like, "Oh, I just learned about this new tool. I saw a talk, it is great, let's implement it." And then their team will never adapt it because it is too complicated or it just doesn't make sense or it doesn't work in their workflow. And sometimes change management is hard. So the first thing I always say is look at your team and your team's culture, how you operate, how you actually do your workflows, figure out the culture and then find the right tool for that culture. Because if you try to just implement tooling when you're building these platform engineering for your organization and it just doesn't make sense to the team, it's not going to get used. you're going to have slow uptake. It's better to understand who you were building for rather than just building a thing and saying, hey, we've made things easier. Well, it's not easier for me. So
On the subject of availability, our guest Martin suggested avoiding pod topology spread constraints, as this is a Kubernetes feature that is simple to understand but has problematic consequences if not understood correctly. Do you have similar do you have similar examples of something in Kubernetes that looked easy but was an absolute nightmare?
autoscalers can be deceptively easy, and some of them are relatively easy, but sometimes people will just set a number of being their top, like, oh, well, maximum number of 100, or and they don't even bother to set their metrics, or they just have a general like CPU metric that they'll set and be like, yeah, this sounds good. They've never battle tested it. They don't even know how their application will actually work on the Kubernetes before they start setting auto scaling metrics. And then all of a sudden things just like I've seen a lot of clusters that will scale up when there was plenty of headroom available in the pods or on the nodes, but because they misconfigured some of their autoscaler features, it just scaled up, but they just kind of plugged and chugged some numbers saying, yeah, this sounds about right. And it went ahead and just scaled higher than they thought it would. And all of a sudden they're like, why do we have this major bill or this massive bill going on? So that is one of the things I want to recommend customers do before they start setting autoscalers and kind of setting some parameters to it, which you should be setting parameters to. Know what those parameters are like. You're not going to get it right the first time. That's just how it works. Unless you're very lucky, it's going to take some testing, but that's what I recommend for my customers and for anybody using Kubernetes realistically at scale.
Now, Kubernetes turned 10 years old last year. What do you expect in the next 10 years to come?
So in the next 10 years, two big things I think are going to happen. One of the big things I'm an advocate of is serverless containers. And that's still servers. Like serverless container sounds like an oxymoron a little bit because like, wait, so you figured out how to run Kubernetes on not nodes or VMs or what? No, of course not. But what I'm starting to see is this idea of being developer focused and user focused. That's kind of what platform engineering is really about. It's like, how do we as platform engineers build a platform that essentially makes it easy for the developers to kind of self-serve and deploy what they need to do without having to ping us often. Serverless, by definition, is exactly that. It is a developer centric, remove the infrastructure or really abstract the infrastructure away from the developers. So I'm starting to see more. I predict more projects. Right now, there are two major ones like Knative and KEDA around these serverless containers. I expect to see more projects grow with them. On another big thing that I see very promising is WASM or WebAssembly. I saw some interesting talks at KubeCon this past year about running WebAssembly on Kubernetes. I anticipate that we will start to see not just containers on Kubernetes, but also these WASM binaries on Kubernetes, and they will probably exist side by side in some manner. I do predict that will happen. And of course, there's kind of the more AI is going to be on Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is going to be big on trading. But I'm sure everybody's heard that ad nauseum. So those are kind of two interesting use cases I see happening soon.
What's next for you, Jay?
For me, I am going to continue to preach the stories of serverless containers and hope more people use it. Also, since this is a Kubernetes-centric podcast, we have KCD, Kubernetes Community Days here in San Francisco Bay Area coming up in May. So please Google that, and you should find the link to sign up.
What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
You can go to my main website of jasonsmith.io or sign up for my serverless newsletter at thecloudisserverless.com.